So did part one blow your mind? Oh, it didn't? Part two is going to. If you guys are just watching this one, obviously there's a part one. Please go watch that first. The link's in the description. And if you guys like this content, please hit the subscribe button. If you're listening on the audio-only podcast, please give me a 5-star review. I really appreciate it. With that being said, let's start part two.
To have an impression of the destruction that hit Rome, I juxtaposed here, again, downtown Rome in the 2nd, 3rd century. And this is Rome around 1500. And you can see that the city is still full of mud heaps, nearly as high as the Pantheon, because they had dug out the Pantheon and thrown the mud that had covered the city behind it. And very few buildings are left. So here you see the Pantheon here you have the Pantheon here you have the Colosseum here you have the Colosseum here. It's a wasteland with a few significant ancient buildings and churches. If you do a close-up on the very downtown of Rome and of the entire empire, stretching 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies, you can see that even in the 16th century, downtown Rome is still used for basic food production, agriculture. So the Circus Maximus is divided in individual fields with water ditches, and you can see the imperial palaces. They still look like a Hiroshima or Dresden. If we turn to Byzantium, we have first antiquity, 1st to 3rd century. The authors of that period, especially Cassius Dio, he tells us that from the 1st to 3rd century, Byzantium, or Constantinople, whatever you want to call it, is second only after Rome. It's the second most important city of the Roman Empire. And it has for the first 3 centuries, basically not one brick, not one house, nothing. But in the 4th to 6th century, when you have this impressive picture of Constantinople I showed you here, in the 4th to 6th century, you have a civilization in Byzantium that is indistinguishable of Roman civilization from the 1st to 3rd century. Now we move to the early Middle Ages, and there is not a single new building in all of Byzantium. Thus, what the scholars do is they turn to texts, and they said the texts are mentioning peculiar buildings, and then they discover that the buildings mentioned by texts attributed to the early Middle Ages, the buildings are indistinguishable of the buildings that are in reality existing here, and that are looking very similar to buildings from that period in the city of Rome. Thus, Byzantium, for the 3 periods, for the 700 years, or if you look at the end, 930s, 1 to 930s, has archaeology, strata with buildings, for some 230, 240 years, give or take a decade. There are no buildings in antiquity, there are no buildings in the early Middle Ages. If we move to Jerusalem, it has a famous stratigraphy, very recently made accessible for the public, Kishle, and it is the finest stratigraphy of all of Jerusalem. And you have a situation different from Byzantium in that way that you have antiquity, but you have no buildings for late antiquity. And you have no buildings for the early Middle Ages. You jump from antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, right into the high Middle Ages, 10th to 11th century. And here you find a building constructed under the Crusaders, a tannery under the Crusaders in the 11th, 12th century, which means Jerusalem is naked of buildings from around 230 to at least the 10th century. And we are puzzled by this because when the Crusaders attack Jerusalem, they kill the Muslims and the Jews in huge numbers. A massacre well attested for in many sources. And we do not understand who the people are they could kill if in this period of the early Middle Age to 10th century there was no new construction in the city. There were no buildings where these people could have lived. Of course, you have buildings down here, but you cannot massacre people in the 11th century that live in the 3rd century. That's impossible. This can only be done if you take out 700 years. Now we move away from these three very central cities and look at areas all through Europe. And I'm doing this very quick because you understood the idea. This is one of the palaces of Charlemagne, 8th century, 8th, 9th, 10th century, and that's the building here. And it is modeled after a building in Cologne 700 years earlier. So you say, why not? Why shouldn't they do this? But if you look at the city of Ingelheim and you ask the archaeologists, okay, this is around 800 something, what do you have deep down at 100? Oh, there we have nothing. So you can see that this is considered to be a renaissance of this building, but on the side there's no stratum with buildings from which the people building here could have learned how to build a site so similar to Cologne. This is the interior of the Ingelheim Aula Regia, and I have to give you one or two quotes here. How the excavators are surprised. They are looking at the 9th century. They say the semicircular building clearly shows the significance of antique models, the only one of its kind in medieval architecture 700 years later. Ingelheim's throne hall, that's this hall, is in the tradition of the antique and late antique palatial aula. And I have to add, the colors here, the painting here you find is down to the chemical fingerprint, identical with colors that were employed 700 years earlier. The aula roof was covered with tiles formed in the ancient Roman way. So you imagine, if you ever built a house, the roof tiles are important. You want to be very correct with the roof tiles that no water is coming through. And why would people in their right mind not change even the roof tiles 700 years later? We move now from Germany to Hungary, and here we show a Roman governor's palace in Budapest, and 700 years later we show the Basilica of Zalavar, and in German it's called Mosarburg. And the excavators are surprised. This building is much simpler, much smaller. They are surprised by the same architectural styles, by the same building materials, and even the smaller details. These are this is painted glass from the 9th century. This is painted glass. These are gaming stones made of glass 700 years earlier. And if you go to very sophisticated material, we come back to that. This is Millefiori glass, and this is 1st century Millefiori glass. And this is the Millefiori glass found in Mosarburg in the 9th century. And you wonder how they could recreate the technologies for such sophisticated items. Again, now we are looking at writing pens the Romans used to write on wax tables with these metal pins. And these are 1st to 3rd metal pins, Roman, and these are metal pins as they were found 700 years later in Mosarburg. We move to southern Italy, and in the 8th, 9th century Langobardian area, there is a small temple, that's why it's called Tempietto del Clituno, and it's built in a style of 700 years before. And the researchers wonder, the Roman imagery of the Tempietto is overwhelming. As well known, it was convincing enough to lead a critic as acute as Andrea Palladio to rank it among the ancient Roman temples. We move now to Spain, northern Spain, Oviedo, and again we have government building of the 9th century with a ground plan 700 years older. And we have here a church, San Julian de los Prados, and the scholars write the surprising ornamental painting in a Roman Pompeian style gives the impression of an antique basilica through and through. They do not understand why this could be achieved 700 years after the original buildings had been built and were destroyed either in the end of the Western or in the end of the Eastern Empire. And again, if you look at these sites from the Longobards or here from Spain, and you ask, okay, this is the 9th century, you built this, do you have anything in the 5th century or do you have anything in the 2nd century underneath? No, we have only that. Now we move to Bulgaria. Here you see Romans Sofia, Ulpia Serdica, with walls 10 to 12 meters high, gates 13 to 15 meters high. And if you look carefully, you can see it's the same type of towers, the same type of gates, the same type of buildings, and even the dimensions of the gates, 10 to 12 meter the walls, 13 to 15 the gates here, 10 meter the walls, 14 to 15 the gates are more or less identical. And if you look at individual buildings in 9th century Pliska, it has an outline of the 2nd century, and the archaeologist Rashev, unfortunately, he died in a car accident. They mentioned, besides the already mentioned antique columns and capitals, Pliska contains other more ancient materials. Most common amongst them are the bricks. A small part of them are Roman from the 2nd and 3rd century. In the 9th century, 700 years later, sealed by the seals of the state or private persons. So now you have to imagine, you build a new major house or actually public building, and you use the bricks, the individual stones in the walls, and you take them from 700 year earlier buildings. And more important, roof tiles are, they believe, used roof tiles. And again, if you build a house, why would you use 700-year-old roof tiles? Because the roof tiles crumble and you have to replace them after some time. A major problem. These are some of the buildings constructed in the Roman city of Preslav. And again, you see the typical basilica style of the 2nd century, 700 years later in the 9th and 10th century. And the Bulgarian archaeologists, they're really, really puzzled. They say the thesis about the antique origin of the monumental buildings in Pliska is not based on the antique materials found there alone. Its most impressive monuments are antique in appearance. It seems more natural to assume that they belong to an earlier epoch, but the archaeological evidence does not allow this, and it's exactly what makes Pliska a real puzzle. They do not understand why in the 9th century people built like in the 2nd century. But if you look at Pliska and Preslav and you ask what you have deeper down, something in the 2nd century or in the 5th, 6th, nothing. They have only this. So you understand, whatever the site, whatever you date in the 1st millennium, there's always only one block. There are not 3 blocks on top of each other, building blocks. There's just one block.
Excellent. So I'll let you take away with this one first. Any thoughts on what we just shared there?
Oh, a lot. I wanted to comment so much earlier. The thing about Jerusalem is pretty mind blowing. And actually, I said I cheated because I listened to him on a few other podcasts. Okay, so what we're told basically is that there was no buildings in between, like the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So so what are the people who are the Crusaders are going in to liberate Jerusalem from? Like, where do they live? Like, what's happening then? And so what I found super, super interesting, he said on another podcast, and I did not know this, maybe you did. So the Romans, when, because they were obviously had all, dominion over all basically the known world. they conscripted like locals to be in their army. Did you know? I mean, did you know that?
I didn't know that. Keep going.
Well, I guess if you like think about that movie Gladiator, like Maximus was a Spaniard, you know, so obviously they conquer these different territories in the army. But we know based on the history we have been taught, Vespasian and then eventually his son Titus lead the charge into Jerusalem. But the general army were not Italians. They were actually Arabs.
When you learn that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, you learn that they razed the city and that the city lay waste at least up to the time of Emperor Hadrian for 60 years. But if you look carefully at who conquered Jerusalem, the high commander, he was an Italian in modern language, but the troops were all Arabs. You see, the Romans would recruit the soldiers where they lived. It was so Jerusalem was not destroyed by Italians. It was destroyed by Arabs. And this is well known because we have tombstones of officers of the legion that destroyed Jerusalem. So we have one big problem here. If Arabs in the service of Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 after Christ, why would they wait for 600 years to live in the city? Why would they do that? I get no answer to this question. But if I look at what these Arabs 600 years later use, it's on the right side here, it's a floor, a mosaic floor with this abstracted peacock pattern. So that's dated around 700, 800, 690, not so precise. Right. And at the left side, the model is from Pompeii. That's 1st century after Christ. So these mosaics are 600 to 700 years apart. So if the Nabateans, whose soldiers conquered Jerusalem, are the same as the Umayyads, then we understand that the Arabs moved right into Jerusalem after they conquered it. That's why the Arab ashlars sit right on the Herodian ashlars on the western wall. That's why the Arabs use the same mosaics, or if you go down, that's why the Arabs use the same millefiori glass and the same glass bottles. They're put 700 years apart, and you cannot tell the difference. You can see that these glass items were even made in the same workshop. The same here, you have this millefiori glass. It's a very sophisticated item, and you have it in the 1st century, and then you have it again in the 8th century. Today we do a very strange, we deal in a very strange way with the Arabs. We say, okay, you forgot to issue coins, you forgot to write, you forgot to make glass like this, you forgot everything. So that's a bit denigrating. But then suddenly we say, but 700 years later, you were geniuses. You saved civilization. You saved the Roman writings and the Greek writings. But it's not so much of a compliment. Why didn't they do their own writing, their own books on astronomy? And so why would they use the Greek and the Roman texts? So in reality, if you take out these 600 or 700 years here, the Arabs and the Romans and the Greeks were living side by side, and they were exchanging their scholarly ideas at the same time. And the Arabs were part of high civilization in the 2nd century and in the 1st century. They did not show up in the 7th or 8th century and were ignorant for the centuries in between. Not at all. I regard them as active partners in Roman civilization. And if it comes to these wonderful colored glass items, I think there are Arab inventions and Israeli inventions, because these glass workshops are found all along the Levant in today's Israel and today's Lebanon.
Right. That's wow.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. So his question to other historians were, okay, so if the Arabs who basically, Vespasian and Titus lead the Arabs into that area, conquer Jerusalem, you're saying, why didn't they just take it over right then and start building?
Hmm.
Well, he's saying they did. And so what's really interesting when you consider that and you consider all these years being lumped together, we're told about like Muhammad and Islam, and like it's pretty far removed from Christianity. But what he was saying is like, no, obviously this stuff is all happening around the same time. And he actually even makes a point to say that the Judaism had a hand in basically, the creation of Islam.
Hmm.
And it's super fascinating to consider that, yeah, so all this time is like, so Christianity is kind of growing in Rome, and then in Jerusalem, it's being what you have taking root is Islam and the remnants of Judaism.
Hmm.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's really fascinating. So consider this. What if, what if the false prophet was Muhammad?
Well, if you place the
I'm
timeline, if you move the Crusades back to the first century now, and then tie in what you just said there, then we're kind of getting an image here of a big event.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, how huge is this? But I mean, obviously, it is. He's absolutely right. And this, I think, a couple other points he makes is when he says that we're told that, well, Constantinople was the second most important city in the Roman Empire, and he's basically saying, but during this time, there's not one building, there's not one brick, there's nothing there. And obviously, when you see what it looks like, it looks just like Rome.
Hmm.
And so I guess what history would tell us is, well, they built it in a Renaissance style of Rome. But it's like, no, but obviously it seems obvious they built it around the same time, and that's why it looks the same.
Hmm. Well, he explains here, basically from the 2nd to the 9th century, no new buildings are being made. Nothing. And he goes all across Europe outside of Rome. He goes all these countries. He goes to Germany, Hungary, Italy, Spain, Bulgaria. And people don't understand. They're saying we don't understand. For example, there's this antique basilica in Spain that's built in the identical style with the same materials as the 1st century, but we can only date it to the 9th century. We don't understand how this is possible, and there's no strata underneath it. It's like, why would they build in this exact style from the 1st century 900 years later using the same building materials? And they can't in their mind just say, maybe it was built in the 1st century, maybe you've got they can't fit it into the narrative that they're supposed to be trying to continue. It doesn't belong here. So they kind of just ignore it. And it's like, let's just forget about that and move on. That's just an intrigue, that's just interesting, I guess. Let's move on. And like the Millefiori glass, for example, like it's not just architecture; it's the things people were using.
Yeah,
like 1st century pens being used in the 9th century. It's telling me they hadn't figured out quills by that point, or some other method of transferring or maintaining ink in a vessel to make it last longer or something. It's like no, they're still using this primitive nail press into. So it's just an odd thing, isn't it? It's like 900 years of no development, no change, nothing at all. Call it a dark age if you want, you know what I mean? But it's like nothing, no advancement. Like, why do they still rigidly stick to this? It must be 9th century when it clearly isn't. Like, is there an agenda afoot? I don't know. It's kind of, are these?
I mean, it's preposterous. Is the chronology actually the way he exposes it naked? It is preposterous because, like, you guys in the chat, just try to consider that if we were still doing the same thing we were doing 700 years ago. I mean, I don't even think people can even imagine what it was like 700 years ago. So we wouldn't even know what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
So no progression in architecture, culture, and language in 700 years. I mean, just even think about like the way we use slang and different kinds of terms and the way everybody's language and like as you get different ethnicities, kind of nations kind of conglomerating together, and all of a sudden the language starts to change a little bit. There's no way that with the chronology we've been taught that those things would not evolve in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, yeah, like that either Rome is expanding or it's contracting. It's doing nothing. like you know, I mean, it is nonsensical to think like that. I don't know. I mean, to me, it is. I think it's sort of undeniable, like that the things that he's saying are correct.
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll just carry on. Let's just carry on because he's about to get
Yeah.
into the Anglo-Saxon view now. We're going to start talking about King Arthur. We're going to start seeing about what was going on in England during these times and Roman
The
occupation
thing
of
about
England.
I can't wait till we get to the Vikings. The Viking stuff is like,
Yeah,
I got some connections to make there.
let's just keep. Also, we get back to the Arabs later as well. So let's just keep rolling with this. I'm going to press play now.
We move to England. One of the major enigmas of England is that at the time when everybody believes the Anglo-Saxons from Germany took over the island, it's dated around 400 after Christ, 5th century after Christ, up to 900. There is not even agriculture in England. There are no fields, there are no plows, there are no farmhouses. So we do not know how these famous Anglo-Saxon kings would feed themselves or would feed their villages, their farmers. And I just give a few quotes. The Saxons tended to avoid Roman sites, possibly because they used different farming methods. But the Roman sites had the best soils, the best water supply. So what farming method would stop you using the best soils and the best water supplies? So the historians expect when the Romans are finished here and the Saxons are moving in here, they would use the compounds of the Romans. They would use the walls to shelter themselves behind them. They are astonished that they don't. And attempts to demonstrate conclusively significant continuity in specific urban or rural sites have run afoul of the near archaeological invisibility of post-Roman British society. So we are looking at 400, in conventional chronology, 400 to 930s. And Fowler, he quotes the evidence of the missing agriculture. In contrast to the field systems of the 500 years or so before and after Christ, there's little evidence in the ground for the next half millennium. Now, Alfred the Great is considered the most famous Saxon king. He's famous here in Poland too because he sent out Wulfstan to find Truso close to Elbląg. And the problem with Alfred the Great's city of Winchester, Venta Belgarum, is that for the 9th century, when he is dated, there's nothing there. There's no palace, there are no farmhouses, there are no streets, there are not even toilets there. It's just nothing. But if you go down in Venta Belgarum to the antiquity period, so here is Alfred's period where there's nothing, here's the late antiquity where there's nothing, but if you go down here, then you have a rich stratum of houses, of palaces, with wonderful Roman mosaics, and nobody claims property of these palaces, of these houses. And I take the liberty to return this property of the palaces in Winchester to Alfred the Great. But I can only do this, of course. I can only give him a palace of 200 in the year of 900 if I cut out 700 years in between.
Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. When they came across, and it's contested, it's about 450 AD, they think, is where the Anglo-Saxons kind of really began to sort of come in. But it's argued that they were pushed back originally in like the 3rd century or something by the Roman occupation that was already there. And then they started to come in after Rome started to recede around 400 and 450 AD. They started to leave, because they were just had no support there. The army was needed to fight the Gauls, I believe, really far south on the Mediterranean border. A lot of barbarian invasions were going on at this time, apparently. It's like, we need the troops out of Britain. No one really cared about Britain, not occupying Britain, so bring the troops out. And I believe later on, there was a request from the remaining stragglers there to help fortify Britain, and they were denied by Caesar at the time. To be like, all right, so it's over. Like, let's just leave this place. And then that's when, we're told, the Saxons came in from these German regions, and they settled in Britain. But by this point, there was just these abandoned Roman cities everywhere, and they didn't use them. We're told they just didn't use them. They just built their own brand new places. In other hand, just avoided all the Roman cities completely because there's no evidence in the digger of them occupying these places, of them bringing Anglo-Saxon German ingenuity and agriculture to Roman lands. There's no plows, Anglo-Saxon plows in Roman fields. You know what I mean? They don't exist. There was no crossover. Yeah. And it's kind of, this makes no sense. Humans wouldn't do that. Like, and he was talking about Alfred the Great, when these early first kings of Anglo-Saxon having his city of Winchester dated and built in the 9th century. There's no evidence it was built in the 9th century, but perhaps it was built far earlier, is what we're saying here. And it is his city to that time, because the city that we do find has 1st century mosaics in them. This guy, why would I have that? Why would you have that in the 9th century if that's where you're dating Alfred the Great to? So, no, we have to bring him far earlier, it seems like. And he explains it later, and I'm going to spoil this here. But to get to the point of this, he's basically saying he believes, I think it was Julius Caesar who invaded Britain. I think it was him in quite early on, wasn't it? The 1st century.
So Julius Caesar is kind of your unofficial first king of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
He called himself dictator for life. It's funny because people argue about how many kings there were in Rome. It's like, you call him whatever you want, but he was most certainly what a king would be.
Well, they argue that, Julius Caesar went in practically unopposed, mainly fighting off the Celts, But what he says is, no. He was not the only person at that time invading Britain. There was war of a mass scale between the Anglo-Saxons coming in and the Romans at the same time. There was a clash. And it's almost as though it seems like they teamed up with the Celts to push back the Anglo-Saxons, and he gets into it later, but he basically dates it all as happening. It all happened at the same time, and they weren't using the same lands because they were at war with each other. It's not like...
Well, what's interesting is I wonder if this could be also that you have the barbarians all attacking Rome, but they're all these different barbarians, but they're actually all the same ones. Is it possible that some of the Anglo-Saxon things were just the Romans conquering Great Britain? Because if you really think about it in a way that one of the weird things that I'm sure a lot of us people in the conspiracy community always have wondered about is Londinium, the Roman city that's really actually London. There's 2 cities of London. And okay, so if the Anglo-Saxons came in and then eventually took over, why did they leave this Roman city that's basically almost still a different, separate, sovereign little thing in London, even till this day? That's weird. And then you have the things like the Rome. I don't think they would just abandon a place like Great Britain. Obviously, we see those strange walls that are built around the island that are just what were those things for?
England, as somebody who lives here, is just littered with Roman ruins, as we call them, and walls and all sorts of things. And it's kind of, it seems odd that they would just abandon it all as well. It really does seem odd that they would just leave what they built behind. All of none of it really makes much sense. They occupied Britain for 400 years and said, nah, forget this, let's go. That's basically what we're told the history is. It's it's not worth it. It's too cold. No one likes us here. It's a drain on resources. Let's just go back where it's warm to the Mediterranean. That's basically our history in Rome.
That basically sums up almost all of history. Is it doesn't make sense, and it's people say, lots of people, I'm sure people like you and I were probably really bored in school when you were in history class. Because history, because it's a lie. It's all made up. It makes no sense. So it's hard to even follow what's happening, and it's so disconnected. And I think that, and obviously these are good reasons why it does not make sense.
No. Let's carry on. It gets into the Vikings now, which is where you wanted to get to. So
this is going to be really good.
Yeah, I'm going to click play on now.
We move to Ireland. Ireland is perplexing because it has this very famous and well-known Celtic patterning art, and you see here 2nd century triscale patterns on a bowl, and then you here see the same, more or less the same patterns in the Book of Kelts some 700 years later. And the archaeologists again wonder that the 5th to 7th centuries in Ireland were a continuation of the 1st century BC. So the 6th century is 700 years after the 1st century BCE, of course, and there's nothing in between. And then, after nothing in between for some 700 years, the culture is, or at least the art decorations are the same. And if we look at this in a more table-like way, you can see Latin settlements and the Celtic Triscale style. And then you have from 200 BCE to 300 CE no buildings. And then in the 8th century you have settlements again, and you have the same Triscale style again. We move to the Viking period. You remember that the catastrophe of the 10th century wipes out these territories here, all over Poland. You go to Bulgaria and you move on down to Mesopotamia. What is the most striking feature of the Vikings? They are considered to have been the most daring seafarers in the history of mankind. But today we believe that these great sailors did not have the square sail from the year 100 to around the year 700. Everybody else, so this is a Roman ship with the square sail of the 1st century or the 4th century, the antiquity or late antiquity, of course they are the same, because these two periods are in chronology like this, but in stratigraphy like this. The Vikings come later with similar ships. These are war galleys and these are transport ships. This is a 2nd century Roman ship, and this is a 9th century Viking merchant vessel. They look very much the same. The same with coins. The Vikings loved their ships and they put them on their coins as much as the Romans on the upper line would show their sailing ships on the coins. And the most puzzling question of the Vikings or the Scandinavians losing the art of sailing is that in the 1st century, Strabo, for example, and even earlier Caesar, they mentioned their ships and the sails. So Strabo even said that they set sail for home, Denmark in this case. Strabo would have said they rowed home to Denmark if they did row home, because people would have had something to laugh about. So we have a big problem, and the leading historian of Viking shipping, Jan Bill, said it is that before the 8th century the sailing ship was not adopted in Scandinavia is puzzling. But if I tell him it is puzzling only if you do not understand that the period of Strabo, 1st century, and the Viking period of the 8th century, they are not on top of each other, that they are side by side, they would say that's just bizarre. Because what does it mean? It means that Julius Caesar comes 700 years closer to us. He's no longer in the 1st century BCE, he is in the 7th century CE. And this is just unacceptable. And if we go back into the Viking sites, you see again here that in the 8th, 9th century, this is Haithabu, the biggest Viking city, you find glass shards that are very similar to glass shards 700 years earlier. And again, you find, now we are at Truso, here in Poland, you find in Truso in the 9th century these wonderful Millefiori glass items as you have them 700 years earlier in Roman times. Again, we can look at different items. Here we go again to Haithabu, Germany. You have a Roman tile of the 1st century CE, 800 years later, and in Truso you have Roman coins of the 2nd century in the 9th century. So if you ask the excavators how is it possible that their sites have items of 700 years before. They say these are heirlooms. They are bequeathed from the parents to the children over 700 years. But there's a problem with this explanation, because neither in Trousseau nor in Haithabu you have settlement strata from the years 1 to 700 in which the parents could have given the items to the children. They're just not there. So in actual fact, what you see in Haithabu or in Trousseau, that within the first millennium, again, you do not have these three periods on top of each other, but just one for around 8th to 10th century, a maximum of 230, 250 years.
Okay, yeah. Now that is what I'm talking about right there. Now that is pretty unbelievable, because the ships. Okay, so what I found most interesting about this was that we have a story in America about Christopher Columbus sailing in 1492. And I clowned on that on Columbus Day in America. And I said the story just sounds completely made up. But I mentioned what we've been taught mostly in history class, and it's kind of like, that's not in the books, that many people believe the Vikings got to North America 500 years before Columbus did. Now it's widely accepted by historians that they did, like Leif Erikson and those. And if it makes sense, because obviously if you look on a map, you can jump from Northern Europe, Iceland, Greenland, and then before you know it, you're in Canada and you're in North America. Okay, now consider this. The ships, the Roman ships and the Viking ships are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for all I know are the Vikings, I mean, I don't want to speak too much, but like, are the Vikings the Romans? Like, you know what I mean? They would be under Roman rule. So, wouldn't they technically kind of be Romans at that point?
Well, like I said, the saying here, the square sail. They're on coins from the first century.
The coins, the sails, the artwork, the glass is all the same.
First century.
Now think about this. So I clowned on my one video saying, so what did the Vikings do when they got to America 500 years before Columbus did? Well, we're told nothing. But if they had the same coins, they had the same ships, they had the same glassware, what if they had the same architectural style?
Mm-hmm.
And if they got to America 500 years before Columbus did, what if they built buildings? What would they look like? Would they look like Washington, D.C.?
Well, Roman Basilica style, first century style.
What if you saw all those the Greco-Roman style all around America that's all mud flooded? What if they built those buildings then?
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the same cataclysm that hit Europe and the Middle East and China and South America hit North America. And that's why that certain style is always, got this mud flooded style. They got the weird basements, all the weird stuff around there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, that to me is like, okay, now we're putting like the real big pieces of the puzzle together. Like what's up with America and the timeline of America making no sense. It always made no sense to me that the Romans would be so advanced in certain kinds of way, and they would have no idea about places like North America, and then they couldn't sail places across
Mm-hmm.
the ocean.
So it's almost
no way.
It's almost like what we're saying here. And again, we're all just speculating here based on what we're discovering today. But to summarize kind of what you're saying here, correct me if I'm wrong, it's that what we call Viking culture is just basically the Scandinavian flavor of Roman civilization. And we've separated them from Roman civilization and acted as though they're completely different. But they also have a pantheistic religion like the Romans do, just with different names for the similar style gods. They have their own thunder god, Odin, no different from Zeus or Jupiter. Or we got by many names, and it's kind of, they just go across and settle across the Atlantic, and they were probably likely built in the Roman style if the ships are identical with the same shape, with the same square sail. And the evidence is showing, without strata, nothing underneath, first century coins in the Roman style, first century boats with the square sails in the Roman style. Mm-hmm. When we're told, oh no, they were only rowing for 700 years. They didn't have sails. And it's kind of like, well, there's no evidence. All the evidence is actually saying, no, they had Roman ships in the first century. And even
Yeah, well,
first
what's
century
funny is,
Caesars
like,
are saying bye-bye with your square sails, back.
well, it's funny what they would say is like that they didn't invent they did that idea of a square sail was lost, but they had the coins with the square sails on them.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
had the Roman coins from the first and second centuries with the square sails on them.
So it's like
So don't you think somebody said, "Hey, what about this design on this old coin?" I mean, I mean, even if that was true, obviously somebody would have said they never would have lost the idea of how to sail when
no.
it's depicted in all kinds of artwork, including the coin, the currency that everyone passes back and forth all the time.
It's almost like the people who made this chronology, the lie, were just hoping no one would bother to look at the coins.
I don't. I mean, I really. I mean, it does. It's kind of one of these things where like a lot of things can be veiled to us, and once you see it, you're like, oh my gosh, this makes so much more sense than what we've been taught. But also, even thinking about like I think even what I was trying to go back to about the Anglo-Saxons, it's like so you had this foreign army invading at a certain time. What if it was just the Romans invading? Like, you know what I mean? Like they're called a certain thing, just like in the same way that, like I just said, that the Romans would have used Arabs to be their army for conquering a place. So what if Julius Caesar was leading this charge of this army that was in that type of place? And when they took it over, those are the people who live there.
Mm-hmm. Well,
you know what I'm saying? So like, so the point being is like saying that the Vikings, there's obviously different cultures or like a different kind of like the regional cultures around there, but they're still Roman. So it's not like the Vikings are going exploring and doing stuff in North America apart from Caesar's, best wishes and things like that. It's like they might be there's one like that's your northern port is the Vikings, right? And those people are going to go do certain things for the empire in their best interest because nobody else can really afford to do anything apart from the empire. So they're going in. They're kind of northern army. They're their northern navy.
From the sounds of it, they were a powerful seafaring force to be reckoned with, experts in sailing. Who else would the Romans send to go on expeditions?
Right.
The best
to get to North America. Which way? Like I said, it makes the most sense that you would go from that part of Europe because it would be the easiest sea voyages to go across.
Those who cling to the Indo-European roots here will be furious at this conversation, denigrating the ancient Norse religions and Scandinavian gods. But this is revisionist history we're doing here. We're looking back and saying, that doesn't add up. The stories you've been told, the history you believe has a true chronology, doesn't. Like, it's actually crumbling here. What this guy has done is basically just said, what you think you know is tenuous at best. It's patchy. It's made up by people who are ignoring things. It's not what you think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the Romans. Obviously, they conquered peoples, and then they used these peoples to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean. So yeah, so like the Anglo-Saxons did do that, but I mean, maybe they weren't. They were looking like Roman soldiers when they did it, and so like that. In the same way, yeah, that you'd have the Huns and you have the Goths and you had all these different types of tribes attacking at the same time. No, they were all the same people. Like these people were similar in the same kind of ways, and they were, likely under one flag, different regions coming together to do things. So like that's what Rome is. You can't conquer the whole world unless you're using other types of people. It's not just Italians dominating the world, it's the Romans. It was a different we need to kind of think past our own kind of narrow worldview about like different regions and states and countries.
Yeah, well, they were aiming for a one world government, weren't they? That they were the beast system.
They had it.
And well, if you want to talk and get all metaphysical about Revelation, it's like the beast that was and that will be again, and it's like these rising kingdoms. It's like if we're in the little season, it's just basically Roman Empire revived. They was put on pause for 1,000 years, and then it came back after the Satan was released. And that's why everything is like a new Rome today. I was listening to Jana, one of the members of our Telegram. She made a video, and she was basically going on saying how I think New York did part of a lot of America used to be called Rome originally when it was built, and it's been renamed.
Well,
since.
there's many cities called Rome. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of cities all over America named after all kinds of other places.
Probably named after the motherlands they're named after. You know,
there's a Rome, Georgia, and places like that. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense that they would name them after those kind of places. And of course, these are also, I think, most people don't realize. Even I was trying to explain to people that Egypt was not called Egypt to the Egyptians. The Greeks called it Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think they called it Kemet or something like that. They called themselves something different than. So it makes sense that you have Greek and Roman names for different places. That's who named the places.
Mm-hmm.
So you would get an Egyptian a place in Egypt known by the Romans or the Greeks.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I mean. Different names from different cultures with different perspectives on the same event. Historians seem to have separated them into separate events or separate places, which has caused the timeline issues. And again, this guy is just destroying it, basically saying, no, the strata doesn't prove that. They're all next to each other. They're not under each other. It's very simple. Mm-hmm. It's like saying it's actually very simple. Why are we putting 700 years here? Like it's just very German matter of fact. You are wrong. It's quite clear. There's no strata. Why are we making up 700 years? It's just
somebody pointed out in the chat that DC used to be called Rome, and that's true.
Exactly. I mean, it's
the District of Columbia.
Yeah. Let's carry on. Let's keep going because it gets deeper. Let's just keep going. I'll press play now.
We move to the Arabs. A brief word about the Arabs. We have about Arab civilization a very strange view. They have a dark side and a bright side. What is the dark side? For the first 700 years of the first millennium, they do not write philosophical or astronomical or poetry texts. They do not issue coins. Before Christ, they do exactly that. And the tribes, the Arab tribes we know after the time of Muhammad, are known 700 years earlier in the time around Christ. So we wonder, why do they not write? Why do they not issue coins? Why do they look absolutely retarded when there were legions of experts around who could have taught them everything? But then, after around 700, comes the bright side of the Arabs. When there's nobody left to teach them anything, because the Western Empire is gone, the Eastern Empire is gone, at that time exactly, they perfectly reenact and recreate Roman culture. I begin with glassware. This is a Roman vase found in Cologne. This is a glass shard from the 9th century found in Samara. And we go to Millefiori glass bowl. This is a Roman glass bowl of the 1st century. This is an Islamic glass bowl of the 8th, 9th century, some 700 years later. Down to the chemical composition, it's the same material. This is the site we are looking at, Samara. You can see 58 square kilometers. 6,300 building. It disappeared at the beginning of the 10th century under glass. It's the largest archaeological site in the world. Nobody understands why it could disappear under glass, but the culture has Roman arenas. If you ever visit a Roman arena, the basement of a Roman arena, you will immediately recognize that even the Roman arena is recreated. The Roman wall painting, this is a wall painting from Bosco Reale in the Gulf of Naples, and this is 700 years later a wall painting in Damascus. And the art historians, they really surprised. The famous 8th century frescoes resort to ancient motifs, show parallels with the motifs of the 1st century frescoes in Pompeii and Bosco Reale 700 years earlier. This is a palace from a wall painting from a palace in Jordan, and it's called the Desert Castle. And the painting, as you can see, a unique painting embellishing the hot room of the bath complex, shows ancient Greek influence after this ancient Greek Hellenistic culture has disappeared for some 700 years. And further down, it's indigenous Hellenism that is local, not alien. So 700, 800 years after Hellenism, they go back to Hellenism. If you go look at the ground plans of their large compounds, it is said that they are recalling earlier Roman cities of the 1st, 2nd centuries, 700 years earlier. If you look at the peculiar arches, they look like Hellenistic arches 700 years earlier. And again, if you ask the experts, what do you have in these wonderful cities from 1 to 700? Do you have strata from which they could have taken models they imitated 700 years later? No, there is nothing. These are 1st century Arab structures, and these are 8th century Arab structures, and there are no Arab structures like this in between.
Quite a short one there. Talk about the Arabic world. Yeah, some colourful language to describe how basically they just didn't do anything for 700 years. The pre-Islamic world, as we're told, because they say Islam was started in the 8th century, even Islam describes this as like a time of just complete degradation, of nothingness. Like it's like a poor time to be an Arab basically in that region. Nothing happened, no advancement. It's like their version of a dark age. And then it says suddenly in the 8th century, massive, huge renaissance of technology, knowledge, influence, everything you can imagine, all happening with the advent of Islam. And then suddenly it's all Roman. Every little bit of it is all Roman 1st century architecture and style. When you
they got real smart all of a sudden, and by getting smart, they did the things they did 700 years ago.
Yeah, which corroborates what you were saying, that Islam was likely created in the 1st century as a counter-revolution to the rise of Christendom from the Jews who were wanted to find an army to fight against the rise of Christianity. More than likely. But what I think this actually does, and it's becoming more clear in my head now, that this was all the Roman Empire. Yeah.
So you call, you talk about these different peoples like they were different countries or they were different kind of sects, but they weren't. I mean, obviously you have different parts of the world, but it's still Rome. This whole thing is Rome. So that's why they have the knowledge of Rome, and that's why they have all the exact same trappings of Rome, because the Arabs were the Romans. Right? I mean, not everybody, we know based on Rome, like not everyone was a citizen of Rome, but just in the same way that in the times of Jesus, Jerusalem was a Roman city.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I think people don't quite grasp that Pontius Pilate was the governor over that place. They put Herod the Great over there. Like, nobody ruled that Rome did not put in charge. They had their prefects, they had their governors. And so there was prefects and governors in the Arab world. There was the same thing in the Vikings. There was the same thing in the island of Great Britain. Mm-hmm. All that stuff was the Romans. Mm-hmm. So that's why all this stuff all makes sense together. And apart from it, it doesn't make sense at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also, just from like, let's say, spiritual standpoint, it feels like in this 1st century, the beast, we'll call Rome the beast, just as a conglomerate that covered many countries. They were making moves. Mm-hmm. They were making moves in these early 1st centuries. They were galvanizing, they were centralizing, they were spreading far, they were dominating, they were doing everything they can to get as much power as possible, going as far north, east, south, west, out into the Arab realms and probably into Asia as well, as much as they could. But and who knows how far they went. Someone was saying there, the Danes were used as like a perfect marine army for Rome. New Amsterdam, for example, New York, it's kind of these named after these European places. I think someone said that Australia was called New Holland when originally found as well. And it's kind of like you have to wonder just how far the tendrils of Rome truly went, and it, all roads lead to where? I was
literally just thinking about that. I was literally just thinking about like the 7 heads, and then we were told there's 7 continents. Like so, and then you see the Greco-Roman style literally on every one of those continents. I mean, maybe.
But it seems like that many of these places that were under Roman control were happy about it. They were happy with what it brought them, because obviously there must have been benefits to being under the Empire of Rome. And it came with wealth and these buildings and these structures and everything else.
Order.
order, yeah, you know, it's like, what have the Romans done for us, going back to Monty Python, you know what I mean? But it's kind of the aqueducts, you know, all these, but never mind all that. It's kind of, it seems like, because what came after this huge galvanization is the 3 destruction events supposedly separated over, you know, hundreds of years, but this is when sudden destruction came upon everything, you know, and I'm sure with these people saying during this time, the Roman Empire will never end. You know, the sun never sets on the Roman Empire. Well, look how great we are. Peace and security, finally. We're no longer at war with each other. We're all under one empire. And then sudden destruction came upon them. And they were just wiped out, buried.
Well, yeah, just think about Revelation 13 when it's like, who is like the beast? Who could make war against the beast? Now you really understand. It's like that this was literally the world. Like, so who's going to fight against the world?
Well, this
is everybody.
The beast kingdoms, the final beast was more diverse than all of the beasts that came before it. You know, it was
terrifying. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's interesting even the way they call like the different ages in the Iron Age. So like this is like the Iron Age when this stuff is happening, and you're like, okay, this actually makes history so much more interesting and it makes so much more sense.
And we're going to get into now what came after this, because he's talking about now all these cultures everywhere were all Roman in the 1st century and up into the 9th century, supposedly. But let's just remove 700 years. They were all...
But the time in the middle, they were really dumb. Everybody got really stupid for a little bit.
Yeah. And there's no evidence there was even time in the middle if you look under the ground. There was just this time where all this was happening. And it looks like
I don't know if we really mentioned that clear enough. If you guys picked up in the video when he's talking about stratigraphy or the stratigraphy or however you want to put that word, is like literally like just think about the mud flood, or just think about like the stuff we find now. Where like I always send Paul and Vitaly in our group chat all these Roman bathhouses. They're always under the ground, but that's pretty much all they ever find is Roman stuff that's under the ground. Isn't it interesting? It's only Roman stuff that's found under the ground, even though, based on kind of the 3 different cataclysms, you'd find different things under the ground. But it's always Roman stuff. But what's under the Roman stuff? Nothing. Nothing's under the Roman stuff. So yeah, so when you archaeologists dig under the ground, and there's history of these different cataclysms and these different places being built on these older sites, but there's nothing under the Roman stuff. So that's what he's saying, like that these buildings are all built on the same level at the same when the history says there was nothing else built during these times, these buildings exist in the same plane as these other buildings.
Yeah, they're next to each other, they're not under each other. They're all side by side, is what he's trying to say here quite clearly. And he's saying that wouldn't happen if they were separated by 700 years. That can't happen. They have to be on top of each other, but they're not. And he shows examples where they did start building on top of others after the cataclysm. And we'll get into that now. Let's keep playing it and let's just see where it brings us.
Come closer, my child.